All right, welcome everyone to the third workshop, the second to last workshop in our fall workshop series on doing longitudinal studies online. This is very much going to be a nuts and bolts kind of talk on the various steps and stages for doing a longitudinal study online. It's really, I think, meant to sort of try to lay out everything in a big picture and provide a structure for you as researchers and thinking about what are the things that I need to do when I'm doing a longitudinal study, and what do I need to plan to do, and what are the problems I need to address up front as I'm designing the study and carrying it out. We do have one more workshop this fall. It'll be in December the 16th on incentivizing online volunteers. So this will be talking about different strategies for incentivization, including monetary and non-monetary rewards. But the basic question there is, how do you get people to give you the best, most authentic, or highest quality data, however you define it. So you can register for that at volunteerscience.com/events. Lastly, we are still taking ideas for the winter workshop series. If you go to allarideas.org/vs_winter_2022, you can vote on ideas and submit your own ideas. And while I'm copy from, while I'm doing, I'll actually share the link in the chat, so make it a lot easier than trying to type it all out. I will do this again at the end of the session as well, so you can click in, but we have a little bit more time. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. So today I want to cover 5 things. What makes a study longitudinal? When we think about a longitudinal study, what is sort of the central logistical problem that we're solving? Not necessarily a scientific problem, but what makes those studies longitudinal? Then I'm going to talk about a couple of different types of longitudinal designs and the stages that each one has. That's a pretty common, I would say near universal, but sometimes people collapse some of these stages into a single stage. For each one of these stages, we'll talk about problems in each stage and best practices for solving them. And then at the end, as some of you saw, there's a little worksheet that's really meant to, again, provide you with structure as you're designing a longitudinal study, the bases that you should cover and the problems that you should be looking to address. All right, so let's get started. So what makes a study longitudinal? We think of some of the big longitudinal studies. I'm a sociologist, so I think of the study for the Ad Health study, which I can't even, it has a long name. So that's hard to remember, but it's the longitudinal study of adolescent health. And that one has been going on for over a decade. So certainly, what makes that a longitudinal study is over 10 years, we're able to study how people have changed and how context in sort of the early part of the study may have affected what we find later in the study. But there's a question of how long does it need to be longitudinal? Is a year's worth of data enough? I think many people would say yes. A month, sure, probably, depending on what you're trying to study. A day, maybe, maybe not. That's really kind of a hard sell. I'm thinking that a day is a longitudinal study. Certainly we would think an hour, probably not longitudinal. Again, it probably depends on what you're studying. Some things do change within an hour. What I think is most important about a longitudinal study is that you're breaking all of this up. So over 10 years, you're not constantly monitoring somebody for 10 years. You're getting them to come back once a year, once every 2 years, maybe once a month. If you're doing something like, the drug interventions for something that has a long-term health impacts, like cancer screening. Cancer doesn't happen every year. So you monitor people for a decade or so. Same thing with the year or month, day, or an hour. In any of these scales, I think what makes a study longitudinal and what makes it really challenging as a form of research is that you have to get people who are going to leave, and then you have to get them to come back, and you have to get them to come back over and over and over again. And the challenge, of course, is when people don't come back, or they miss a wave, or they miss a particular dose, or what have you. You have to be able to address that as a scientist and as a practitioner. How do you get them to come back? And how do you keep them on track, or how do you account for any kind of missing data? I will talk much less about how do you handle missing data and more of the logistics of getting people to show up and come back. So let's talk about design types. I'm going to go into each one of these in more detail, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this individual slide. But generally, we're thinking about some short studies, these back-to-back studies where you're doing something in a very short time frame. A treatment-directed longitudinal study where whatever your treatment is, that determines how frequently somebody comes back, and how often, and how long they need to stay in the study. Waves, I think, is much more common in the social sciences, where you have somebody doing a survey every month or every year. And then a panel is less structured, but you're still looking at change over time. So let's get to nuts and bolts here on some of these. So I use this example of this chronotype study, where we had people participate in 3 study tasks over 3 days. There was an initial study where they did, their survey, where they provided the demographics, and then we told them, are you a morning person or a night person? And then a day later, they had to come back and they had to do the morning test. So they did this reaction time task in the morning, and then they did 24 hours later an evening test where they had to come back and do the reaction time task in the evening. And the idea was, if we told people they're a morning person, did it affect their morning test versus their evening test difference? But the idea of the back-to-back longitudinal study is that you have a very task-driven and typically very short time-framed longitudinal study where you have somebody coming back within a day or a week to perform a specific task. And in this case, you're not asking for people to participate or provide a lot of data over a long period of time. It's a very short, contained, well-defined type of study. So not every longitudinal study is 10 years. The next is treatment directed. So one of the projects that I'm currently working on is an intervention study with couples where we're trying to get them to share the housework more equitably. And the idea here is that we want to give a 4-week treatment period or process, where it's 3 treatments over 4 weeks. So there's an initial intake period, and then we're going to, at the end of the first week, we'll do a treatment. At the end of the second week, we'll do that same treatment again. 3rd week, same treatment, and then the final 4th week, we're going to measure the effect without a treatment. But the idea here is we're going to have people showing up once a week, virtually in this case, to participate in to receive the treatment and get some measurements from their housework sharing. One of the interesting things about this particular kind of treatment-directed study is that people are actually going to be filling out data throughout the period, and they can do it at their own pace and their own time. In this particular example, we have people taking account of how much housework they're doing over a given week, and people aren't really good at remembering that kind of stuff. And so we're allowing them to fill out that piece at any point throughout the week, or as they do it throughout the week. The only thing that we care about is that come Sunday night, their account of the prior week is as accurate as they can get it. And so in this case, one of the advantages of the using an online system is that you allow people to provide their data as they created. And what makes it sort of longitudinal is that at some point you count it as official or accurate data for the type of behavior that you're trying to measure. But again, the thing that makes something treatment directed different is that you have to have a clear sense of what the treatment regime is going to be and what kind of data you need to collect during that treatment regime. Again, the most common form of longitudinal study, I think, is waves. Sometimes the waves can be even, so once every year, once every month. In this case, they're recruiting or they're collecting data on people. This is the health study. They collected data on people as they had funding for it. So they had funding in 94, 95, and 96. Then they got funding for a new wave in 2001, another wave in 2008, and then another wave in 2016. And each one of these waves of sampling had funding for different dimensions of data collection. So the first wave had students, administrators, and then sort of in-home parent surveys. And the parent student surveys are sort of core of all of this. But each wave, they're collecting different kinds of information. And the idea is that every time you do a wave, you're collecting the data that you sort of prioritize in that wave. The main challenge here is making sure that 6 years later, you can find the same people and get them to participate again and be able to link them across waves. Get into the nuts and bolts of this later. But this is meant to give you an idea of the different structures for longitudinal studies. They don't have to be in the wave format here. The last one I'll mention is a panel. So we've been working on this COVID-19 panel for folks in Northeastern. And basically what we did was we ran a bunch of Facebook ads. We recruited about 5,000 people in the United States. We asked them to participate in a survey roughly once every month. And so they signed up, they did their initial demographic survey, and then generally every month or so, the researchers send them an email to say, hey, we have a new survey, can you take it? But what makes this a little bit different from the wave is that there are special purpose surveys. So not every month there's going to be a survey, and sometimes they want to do a survey around a specific event. In this case, there's a lot of political scientists on this, so they did a special survey before the 2020 election. I think they've also done a special survey around the insurrection, the January 6th insurrection. So in this case, what sort of makes a panel different from a wave is that the panel you sort of want to tap into whenever you have a study that you want to do. They're sort of always available. Whereas the waves, you are contacting everybody all at once, generally for a single measurement, very often at a uniform time scale. Another advantage of the panel is you don't necessarily always have to interview or collect data from the whole group. So sometimes you can sample subsets of the panel of participants. Okay, so let's talk about the process of doing a longitudinal study. I think of this as having 5 stages. So again, I say sometimes things are grouped together. You see screening and sign-up and empanelment often happening all at once, especially for projects that are relatively lighter lifts. So there's not as much work for people to do, or they're shorter time frame. So again, you're not trying to get people who know that they're making a 10-year commitment, for example. So anyway, the 5 stages first are recruitment, screening, sign up, empanelment, data collection, and this final disposition. In the recruitment phase, this is getting people to show up in the door. I'm going to go into more detail on each one of these, but I just want to give you a sense of the big picture. And this could be using social media posts, social media ads, from your local university or a hospital, particularly if you're doing medical research. You may be going into the hospital clinic and finding people who have a specific disease to participate in a clinical trial, for example. Or you may use the phone and letter as a stand-in for probability sampling. So sometimes you'll use address-based sampling or phone-based sampling to try to get a representative sample, or I should say non-probability or a probability-based sample of participants. But no matter how you're recruiting people, they're going to then go through a screening process. This could be with a person on the phone. This is very frequently something where you're doing a heavy lift kind of ask, or you're in a clinic and you have very sensitive data, or you want to be very sure that the person who is participating actually qualifies. Again, frequently, the research that we're doing is not that high risk. So we're not having to verify that somebody is over the age of 18. So this, the chronotype study, for example, we're not going to ask for people's ID. If they say they're 18, we're going to assume that they are in fact over 18. We give people the benefit of the doubt in that sense. But in the screening phase, the whole point is to make sure that somebody qualifies as a legitimate participant for your study, and there are levels of verification there. The next stage is sign up and empanelment. And sign up is about collecting the contact information, or however it is that you're going to get people to show up or remind them to show up. So this can be email address, phone number, physical address. If you're in a setting where people prefer WeChat, getting connected to them through WeChat. An empanelment is about collecting the data that you need to identify the kinds of participants you need to contact and the basic data that you'll need throughout the entire set of data collection. So this can be basic demographics. So you just want to know, who is participating and did we get enough racial, economic, age, gender diversity in the sample, or do we have a sample that represents the population we're trying to study? The other side of empanelment is collecting the data that you'll need to actually do the contact management. So again, there's questions around diversity, but if you want to, for each wave, make sure that you have at least a certain percentage of each age, education, racial category, then you'll want to have that data as part of your contact management system, so you know who to reach out to if you have too few people with less than high school education, for example. So sign up and empanelment is really about collecting the data that you'll need to do the management part of the longitudinal study. Data collection process is, I think, what most people think of when they think of the longitudinal studies. It's, what are we going to ask when? And what kinds of incentives are we going to offer for people to participate in each sort of leg of the study and to come back and stay members of the study. So I'll sort of wave my hands at that one for now. The last thing I'll point out is this final disposition. Most people, I don't think about how does the study end for most participants. But when you're doing a longitudinal study, one of the things that's really important is making sure that you have a sense of when people are getting completing the study and when you want to kick them out. A part of that is you don't want to have imputed data for people who haven't responded. You also don't want to try to respond or contact people who are not responsive. You're wasting time and energy trying to get people to show up who aren't going to show up. So it's important when you're thinking about planning out your longitudinal study. What do you want to do with people at the end, or how do you want to decide when somebody has ended? Obviously, the last wave is a point of completion, but at some point you need to assign somebody as the disposition of attriting, no longer being a part of the study. So again, let's go sort of deep into each one of these. As I mentioned with recruitment, the goal is to get people to walk in the door, the proverbial virtual door. On the right-hand side, I have an example of, this is basically our version of a flyer online. I think one of the challenges with doing online studies is people don't think about creating engaging sort of sales pitches on why it's important to participate in your study. You sort of show up and there's a survey and there's this consent form. Or you have this very generic flyer that says anybody over 18 can do this. But I think that one of the things that is especially important in longitudinal studies, we're going to be asking people to do so much, is to, at the very beginning, have a very strong argument for why it's important that they participate. There's a bunch of strategy that goes into recruitment. We have a whole video on how to recruit subjects online on our YouTube page, our YouTube channel. I encourage you to go there and see the different kinds of modalities of subject recruitment. We have another worksheet there that'll help you think through different kinds of recruitment paths, recruitment options, but I won't really go into many of those here. The biggest issues when you're doing recruitment are cost. And this can be time if you don't have money to pay people, but if you have RA time or your own time, or it can be the money. You are paying RA or you're paying for online ads. Any method of recruitment will generally work if you have enough time or money. If you're getting one person every month, right? If you have 3-4 years, you can do it. But it doesn't mean it's worth all that time or money. Maybe there are better ways of doing it. The other issue is sample bias. Your recruitment method gives you people who are in some ways different from the population you're trying to talk about. Generally, sample bias is unavoidable, but at least you want to minimize it and identify it in your recruitment. So my suggestion is sort of twofold. in general, you want to try different things. And this is one of the nice things about online methods is you can change out your recruitment methods pretty easily. You can go from different social media platforms for advertising or Google Ads for advertising. If you need to switch to Mechanical Turk and use Mechanical Turk to do your longitudinal study, you can do that. But again, you can sort of try different things and figure out which one actually works. Save you is feasible in terms of cost and gives you the least biased sample. But the idea is you try a couple of things, see what works, and then actually execute on the thing that actually works. In order to make that process work, you have to track your costs and bias. So you want to make sure that you have instrumentation in your study so that you know where people are coming from, which mode of recruitment. So you have a sense of the costs for each mode of recruitment. And then you also want to know the types of people who are coming from each mode. So one of the challenges with the COVID-19 study, we were using Facebook ads, and Facebook was bringing us a panel that was about 90% white. And so fortunately we caught that early and we were able to mitigate it somewhat. But you have to understand that if you're not paying attention to this stuff as people are coming in, you're very likely to get a biased sample. That's a question. Yes, yeah, contacting people for later waves. With Mechanical Turk specifically, I'm going to get to this in, let's see, data collection part. But I will mention with Mechanical Turk, you can't collect email addresses, but you can send people direct messages, and you can tell people up ahead of time that, on December 1st, we're going to do our next one, and on January 1st, we're going to do the one after that. And that level of communication through messages on Mechanical Turk can help. I think one of the greatest examples of how that worked really well was Andrew Mao did a study with 100 Turkers where he had them come back every day for a month to do prisoner's dilemma experiments. He wanted to do this long-term prisoner's dilemma experiment. And by using the messaging and scheduling via Mechanical Turk, he was able to get something like 95% of people to show up every day. So it's possible to do it with Mechanical Turk, even though they don't let you collect contact information. I don't know about Prolific, which is another company that offers research subjects. They have a messaging system, but the messaging system is pretty essential to doing longitudinal studies with these kinds of paid pools. Let's see. Yeah, of course. All right, so screening. The goal here is identifying who qualifies, and the big issue here is mostly around deception. So if you say I'm going to pay $50 for Hispanic men under 25, you're going to get a lot of people who pretend to be Hispanic men under 25 to make that money. So that's one critical issue. The other one is commitment. So you can get somebody to show up in the door, but you can't get them to, but they're not the kinds of people who are going to come back once a month for something. So in this upfront screening process, you want to make sure that you are, discouraging deception and encouraging the people who are more likely to commit to whatever it is that you're asking them to do. So the best practices here generally are not to disclose your selection criteria before screening. Sometimes it's easier than others. So what you sort of don't want to do is you don't want to have 200 people come in, do this big survey, and then only 5% qualify for the study. What you would rather do, one, is either ask those questions up front, so 200 people fill out 1 or 2 questions before they get kicked out. Or the other way to do it is to have some way of verifying that eligibility. So very frequently people will ask for images of state-issued IDs, and they can use this to guarantee people's age, race, and gender, at least as reported to the state. So you can't claim that you are over the age of 18 and then submit a state-issued ID that's says you're over 18 without actually being over 18. People have fake IDs, but still. So there are ways for you to try and verify outside of the survey to ensure that people actually do qualify. I think the reason why you would want to try to sort of escalate this is typically cost. So how much encouragement is there for deception? So the more you're paying people, the more likely they are to deceive, or more incentivized they are to deceive you. And you want to make sure that you are able to check that. The other part on the commitment side is having participants sign a statement that says, I understand that this study is going to require a 10 to 15 minute survey every week for 4 weeks, or I need to show up once every year for the study. And this can be also as part of almost like a participation quiz or an instruction check that says, okay, how long are we asking you to come for this? So it's 4 weeks, right? How long are you serving? 10, 15 minutes, and a signature. But the whole point here is to get people to not just click through, but to force them to stop, prove that they have read the instructions and that they understand the ask. None of this stuff is foolproof. It's not perfect, but all of this is here to help set expectations for people and to sort of protect you as a researcher from wasting your time and energy on people who don't qualify or who are not going to show up. But think more about the screening. Again, most people, they just put us all in one single survey, or they're like, fill out a demographic survey, fill out the initial empanelment survey, and then, oh, you didn't screen in. We don't need you. You can try to not do that. Next, okay, sign up and empanelment. Again, I sort of foregrounded this by saying it's about 2 things, which is contact information and study information. A couple of things that people forget to do is verify contact information. So frequently this happens when somebody just does a typo. And so they put their number in wrong, or they forget a dot in their email address, or they just misspell their own email address. It happens. You want to make sure that you verify the contact information by sending a test text message or a test email, just to make sure that they receive it. The next big issue here is just the study information. The core, I think, issue here for the data that you collect and how you store it is segregation. Making sure that you are protecting your participants' privacy and being consistent with your IRB's confidentiality plan. So if you tell the IRB, I'm going to segregate all of the subject data from their contact information, then you can't collect any study information and use that as part of your subsequent communications with subjects. So what you want to do here, at least, is understand what data you need for these subsequent follow-up contacts. And you make sure that that goes through IRB, and that when you are saving the data and putting it into a system, we have our own system for contacting subjects that link subject contact information with their subject data. We want to make sure that the data that's in that system is segregated from the data that's not supposed to be in that system, that's just for scientific data analysis. Last thing is demand effects. So, people just went through the sign up process. We just said, hey, you're Hispanic under 25, you qualify for this $500 study. The challenge there is making sure that you let people know that everything that they say from this point on will not affect how much they make, or if it does, you let them know after the fact that it doesn't change. Again, all you wanted to do is mitigate the possibility that people will want to deceive you because they have a sense of, if they answer in a specific way, they're going to make more money, or that they're going to give you an answer that you want or that you don't want, but they want you to have. Again, the best practices here, instant verification when they sign up, and then the data segregation plan. On the data collection side, so this is the heart of the study. The whole goal here is that everybody in the study provides as much data as you can throughout the entire study. So issue number 1 issue number 1 and number 2, attrition and compliance. You're making sure that people come back and that they fill out the data like they should. Beyond that, you just have data quality and linkage, making sure that you are sort of keeping your house clean, and then information updating. So the information changes, there's some data change, some data don't change. And you want to make sure that the data that doesn't change, shouldn't change, doesn't change, that the information that does change or should change, does change or can change. So on the issue of attrition and compliance, because people agree up front to participate in a longitudinal study, sending lots and lots of reminders is okay. This is not somebody where you are cold contacting them. They don't know who you are. They have no idea what you're asking them for. They may forget, right? They may forget, but at some point they did agree to it. And so sending them, up to 10 reminders is fine. Especially if you already know who has responded and who hasn't. So if somebody responds after the 3rd reminder, if you're able to track that and not send them that 4th reminder, that 5th reminder, that 6th reminder, then I think you can really go up to 10 reminders easily. And these can all be gentle reminders. You have your initial hey, it's wave 2, come participate. Don't forget to participate in wave 2. Wave 2 is about to close. Those basic reminders. After that, little reminders as, hey, we noticed you haven't finished your wave 2 survey. Please do it now. And do one of those every day or 2, depending on your time frame. I say the idea here is just that people are not opting out of the study, they're just busy. Or they don't have the time for it, or they're not in a position to do it. And so all you need to do is continue to encourage them to do it until they do it. Because they've already agreed that that's what they want to do. And they've already said that they understand that they're willing to participate. The other thing I will say about reminders is that it definitely should be multimodal. So some people, they're by their phone when they are free, and they're not at their computer with, by email when they're working. And so sending an email works for some people. Sending a text message works for others. You can have people select which one they prefer, but at the end of the day, you'll want to use as many different modalities as you are allowed to use or have gotten authorization to use to send those reminders. And if you can keep track of which ones work for which types of people, you can make this a bit more efficient of a process and a little less pestering. But again, at the end of the day, you have to understand that these people did agree to participate. They signed a statement that says they understood the requirements, and you're just trying to send them gentle reminders to participate. For the data quality, and even for compliance, but mostly around data quality, you want to make sure that you have, as best as you can, an automated system for compliance and data checks. Mostly because first off, again, people sometimes they click the wrong thing. They put in the wrong race because they thought they clicked something. I used to have a computer where when I scrolled on the mouse pad, it would sometimes scroll through the radio buttons, and so sometimes errors happen. And so the compliance system is about just keeping the data clean, especially if you can do it when somebody submits the survey. But also on the back end, just checking, having an RA come back and run a script that says, did people's race change? Did people's country or location or immigration status change or something like that? Things that shouldn't change don't change, and things that should change do change. The more you can automate it, the easier it is for you to do it when people submit their data or when you receive the data from them, and they can fix it as soon as possible. The last thing I mentioned here on the ongoing data collection is that you should find and fix problems early, which means not only this data quality piece, but also if people don't understand a question, or if people are having problems logging back in to the system, if people are not able to find their old login information, that you're able to hear those problems and fix those problems. Because certainly data quality issues that last throughout the entire longitudinal process are going to be harder to fix than trying than fixing it early on. And if one person has a problem and reports it, that means that 10 others have experienced that same problem. So if you're getting 2 or 3 or 4 emails about something, then in reality, about 40 people will probably experience the same thing. So you definitely want to be responsive to troubleshooting reports early on. The last thing I'll say about data collection, this is really sort of a technical thing, but when you're online, it's more difficult, is linking records across cases. So with volunteer science, people can log in, for example, and then if they log in, we know who they are, and they don't have to put in any information. Like we can just say that this is user ABCD in wave 1, and this is user ABCD in wave 2. But most researchers don't want to have the people log into volunteer science, and that means that researchers then have to figure out how to connect user in wave 1 to that same user in wave 2. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. One, of course, is have them putting in their email address every time or some other unique identifier. What's the problem with email addresses is that people have multiple email addresses and they forget which one they used. So that's not a perfect way of doing it. The other way of doing it is unique identifying codes. Very frequently, you do this through links. You send them a link to the survey with their unique identifier there in the URL, and then you just pull it out of the URL and save it. One of the things that I recommend is being redundant about it, so that you have the unique identifier and the email address, and then you just check the email address to make sure that it matches. Or use that as a backup and then delete it so that it's not a part of your scientific data. Again, going back to the data segregation plan. But I think the worst thing to happen is you lose the ability to link data across waves because somebody logs in with a different machine or they provide you with a different email address. And then you have to go in and say, oh wait, who is that? Where did this data come from? And which user is this attached to? That's one of the weird, wonky things about doing online longitudinal studies is matching across instances. Mechanical Turk is less bad with this because most people have a single account. If somebody has multiple accounts is usually a problem. But again, the question is how much do you want to trust that the person's MTurk ID is stable across time? I think for the most part, it is. For most use cases, it is. But if it's really important to you to be able to track 100% of your sample, you may want to use an ID-based system. All right, last thing, final disposition. Again, even at the end, you'll sort of get to the end of your study and say, oh, some of these people never showed up, and so at some point they didn't finish until they were attrited. But there are certain studies where being able to know that somebody attrited early on is really important, because you want to know, after wave 2, suddenly you have 10% fewer African Americans in your sample, and now suddenly your sample is not nearly as diverse as it was. And so you need to do some supplementary recruitment or try and get some of those folks back. So one of the things that I suggest early on is having a definition of attrition. At what point do you consider somebody as having attrited? And how do you escalate to that point? And I use the word escalate because when you're doing a longitudinal study, you're contacting people a lot, you're trying to get them to come back. Certainly not everybody's going to participate in every wave. And if your attrition policy is if you miss a wave, you're out. Then what you want to do is you want to send everybody the reminders, but then have an escalation process that says, hey, look, we're going to kick you out. We're going to continue. We're going to count you as no longer a member of this panel if you don't participate. Or hey, we see you haven't participated in this wave. Are you still interested in it? That's sort of a softer form. So the issue here is twofold. You don't want to not know whether somebody has attrited or not, because you want to know at what point is the data missing versus the person's just not participating. And of course, lastly, you want to know at the very end, how many people finished. There's a basic question there about how many people finished and how many people didn't. And what counts as participating. When we were doing this COVID state survey, some people will participate in 3 out of the 6 surveys. And the question for us is do we want to count all 3? or do we want to consider this person as having not been a part of the sample for a particular analysis? In some cases like that, it's not too salient to do it at the level of the entire study, to say if somebody misses 2 out of 3, then they're out, or their data is not usable. But at some point you have to make that call. So the best practices here, first of all, for people who finish, you should always celebrate it. So say thank you, send them a nice note, send them a copy of your latest article, something that's like that says you finished, thank you so much. Similarly, for the entire study, when this entire study completes, I think that you should send everybody a thank you note, do like a thank you workshop or a thank you training, or like something that lets people see the results of what they did if you can. On the attrition side, I suggest having either deciding on a hard drop or a soft drop. And a hard drop being, at that certain point you're out and you're never coming back. Versus a soft drop is, we don't think you're participating. We're not going to send you any more emails. The only thing we're going to do to try to get you back is every once in a while we'll say, hey, remember that time you participated in the study? Would you like to come back? Hard drop is really about getting that early, clear definition of attrition for those who need it. So if you're doing like an intervention study and you want to know whether an intervention works, if somebody doesn't get the whole intervention, it doesn't really count. So you need to have a clear understanding of the attrition, and you need to have a hard drop policy. But if you're doing, a panel, a bunch of surveys, and you're have this big pool, the soft drops can save you some time in terms of contacting folks and data cleaning and saying, look, we're not going to contact you since you haven't. We're not going to consider you a part of the panel since you haven't completed any surveys in the past 6 months. That's just a way of keeping your data clean. Last thing I'll mention, this is mostly around a GDPR, CIPRA kind of good data hygiene and data legal coverage, but you should have a protocol in place for deleting data. People, I think, at this point expect you to be able to delete data, even if they don't have the right, the legally established right to have their data deleted. But the protocol can be, this is exactly how we delete data, or this is what you need to do to have your data deleted. But for people who decide that they, on their own, no longer want to participate, that they have the ability to rescind their consent and then have their data deleted. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of this. This is really meant to be a guide for you. Again, this is something that I'll send around separately. But the idea here is we're going through each of the 5 stages. We're looking at the basic questions that you're trying to ask or answer in these stages, what the incentives are for high and low quality data, and then some of the tools and tactics that you can use to ensure that or I guess these are the questions that you should answer when you're planning out your study, so that you can align the incentives to get the best data that you can at each of these stages, or at least understand the trade-offs when you're designing your study. So again, I don't want to dwell on this too much. I'm going to give you a copy of this with all the questions in it, and then I'm going to give you a copy with no questions. That's really just meant for you to fill in for your particular study as you are designing it. And with that, I'm actually going to say thank you. We're going to end a little bit early today. I wanted to set aside some time now to do questions or talk about specific projects that you have. If you want any kind of feedback on your project, I'm happy to ask or answer those questions. Before we get to that, I'll just mention again, we have the Incentivizing Online Volunteers workshop in a month. I'm going to share again the All Our Ideas link for anybody who came in late and just for convenience. So if there are other things that you want us to cover in workshops in the winter, let us know. We'll take your ideas and design our program around that. And if you need any help, you can always email me, jason_radford@volunteerscience.com. We do a lot of online research and a good number of longitudinal studies. So we've seen a lot. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can open up the chat for Q&A. Let me find the recording button in the small. There we go.